Hello, and welcome to our second episode of Murmurs on the Mooring, the Scottish Traditional Boat Podcast. My name is Magnus, and I'm a naval, maritime and coastal history student, and I'm working with Nell, who's learning to be a traditional boat builder. We will bring you varied stories from coastal communities which have shaped Scotland to how it is today. We both grew up in the northeast of Scotland, and this is the unofficial starting point of our research and the podcast. We hope that this podcast is for everyone, so if there is any point in this podcast where we talk about something you don't understand or know, please contact us on social media or by our email, which is tradboatpodcast@gmail.com, and we'll happily find other words and ways to talk about it. It's nice to all be on the same wave. In this episode, we're offering a whistle-stop tour of Scottish fishing under sail, spanning the period from the Vikings' arrival to the age of engines. Although there were many small craft and fishing practices operated by oar and sail over this 1,000-year period, we focus on the development of sail fishing, which culminated in the Scottish herring industry. We'll be leaving the tales of more regionally specific boats for future episodes. This story comes to an end when we reach the early engined craft, like steam drifters, because this truly is the start of another story, the one we live in today. After this episode, we'll offer a wee sequel where you can see and be involved with traditional boats in Scotland. We hope you enjoy.
So this is from Inshore Craft of Britain in the Days of Sail and Oar, kind of a Bible by Edgar J. March. In the preface, it says, "Today, those of us who are in the evening of life look back on an era that seems as remote as that of the Pharaohs. The invention of the internal combustion engine, driven by paraffin, petrol, or diesel oil, completely changed a pattern of life which had existed for centuries, and standardised hull design to a great extent too." It goes on to say different areas had developed boats to a design suitable for the local beaches and waters, or for the occupation of their owners, individualists of independent character. Which I think is a nice summary or snapshot of the fact that our boats were, and our fishing methods were, roughly the same for so many hundreds of years, until very recently.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really beautiful way of looking at the fishing industry over a time of 200-300 centuries where not much changed, and even though there were changes, to the layman things would have looked outwardly the same. So I think it's interesting that the changes that March talks about must have been really visible when they came.
Yeah.
From being this sort of really gradual evolution, and suddenly everything goes like bang, and you've got engines, you've got steel, you've got iron being used in a really like meaningful way.
Yeah, and the history of 80 years previous feeling as distant as the ancient Egyptians, that's quite an analogy to give.
Absolutely. And I can totally see it. So you've got boats that were straight out of Viking sagas, looking like that anyway.
Yeah.
Operating alongside what some would refer to them as like steampunk looking spewing coal machines. It's like, that's a pretty radically different image that for a while sort of coexisted, which is...
Yeah, it looks amazing in some of the films that we've seen.
Absolutely, yeah.
And we can add the links to those wherever people are looking at this. Shall we go through the history of the whole design then, of that really long, almost stationary period? We know it wasn't stationary, but it does historically look pretty, what's the word? Consistent.
Yeah, stable. I think. Yeah. I think that'd be really good, really useful even for us, because it's complicated, and it's such an interesting history because it was so... I mean, it's quite nuanced, but there was a lot of difference even in really local proximity.
Yeah.
These different developments of certain things that benefited certain people at certain times were maybe different, and that's really interesting to get into. So I think our story. Well, where do you think our story really begins? Because it's you can go back really very far if you want to, but
I think we should begin with the Vikings arriving in Scotland, bringing with them probably what we did already have to an extent, but definitely to a far greater extent, this clinker-built, quite large ship design that could sail open seas and still be pulled up onto a beach easily in the coastal areas.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think in your head you can probably imagine what a Viking longship looks like. It's a really iconic shape. This sort of, it's sort of like if you were to get a child to draw a boat. It's like a boat with a single really large mast and sort of really beautifully curved stem and stern. But the Vikings knew their soul. These boats were quick and they were incredibly seaworthy. I mean, I remember when I was in Iceland, I was reading about how they could get from like North Norway to Iceland in 72 hours with the wind. I think that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
That's as fast as you could do it now, really. So they knew what they were doing. They brought over that technology, and I mean, we don't know what the reception was like to that because there's not really much available to read about, but it clearly like changed a lot of what was going on in Scotland at the time.
Yeah, for sure. I guess we don't know specifically the boat reception, but
No.
we do know a lot about the social reception.
Yes, yeah, a bit of a mixed bag there, but
yeah, and certainly they did develop a lot of our infrastructure in Scotland for boats and ships. 2 days ago, I was in Pappy or Papa Westray, and there they've got a Viking harbour.
Mm-hmm.
It's on the east, and it's in the perfect spot for anyone coming from the north, looking for the first sheltered place in the north of Orkney, who wants to go down further into the islands of Orkney and not just past to the rest of Europe or mainland Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
And that infrastructure remains and still looks very useful.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that it's really interesting because this Viking infrastructure is much of like, I mean, you could go really deep into the history of the Vikings, but if you look at port cities that have developed in certain parts of the British Isles, like Dublin, that's Viking. Even ports, around Orkney and Shetland, and a lot of the Western Isle ports of Stornoway, that was all developed in this period. So without the Viking influence, it's really, I mean, it's such a huge what if, but it's really difficult to imagine what Scottish coastal infrastructure, specifically in the north and the west, would have looked like.
Yeah.
But there's a really tangible link from even till fairly recently with this sort of Viking design
In the Scottish boats.
Yeah.
And we see it's kind of being appropriated. Their boats, although used a lot in the fjords and developed, of course, for fishing, were really being used and the design spread through long voyages. And our Scottish fishermen didn't take up the idea of travelling, they just took up the idea of a very good boat to continue the things that they were doing, which were mostly sort of supplementing a crofting lifestyle, getting out on the sea a bit. Some people are more farmers, some people are more fishers, but keeping that diversity of diet and income
definitely
on the go. So we end up with, I guess, the Scaffie.
I think that's probably like the sort of tangible link to certainly in the part of the world that we know to the Vikings. Is the Scaffie. So the Scaffie is this boat, small vessel, generally under 35 feet. It'd be really rare to get a bigger Scaffie than that. And the word is interesting. It's like some say that it comes from the word skiff, which maybe is sort of a word colloquially used for boat. So it's just, this is an boat, I suppose. But it's a type of vessel that was developed and was used continually for 200-300 years in certain parts of Scotland.
Yeah, and predominantly the east. On the west, the Viking boat quickly gave way to a boat known as the Berlin, which again looks really similar, if not closer, to the Viking design. Retaining the square sail. On the east coast, the square sail evolved to something we see as the lug rig, which I don't think counts as a square anymore.
What would you call it then if it's not a square?
Oh, I don't know. A polygon.
A polygon. Yeah, maybe. But it's interesting. The Scaffie is it was not traditionally, but it was often used out of places where there wasn't much infrastructure, because in a lot of cases there wasn't that infrastructure, and it might just be that you'd haul it up onto a beach, because they were usually quite small boats. That was quite feasible, and they were a well-honed design, which was a good sea boat, but they were still very limited. They had no covered deck, so in heavy seas it would have been pretty tough going. They had a pretty low rail, so that you could still row. That was still something that would often be used to get in and out of shallow estuaries or bays, but also just if you're becalmed, or even when you're fishing, it gives you a bit more dexterity and ability. But it meant that you could quite easily be swamped in high seas with a low rail. So it was a bit of a compromise. And it's definitely worth reading Ian Stevens' chapter in Boatlines about Scaffies, because he talks about that, about the design being suitable for fishing on a really small scale. But this is before fishing became what we would call an industry. This is like subsistence, maybe, to supplement your farm, or it might be your livelihood, but it's probably you and your family, and it's just making enough to get by. So and it, around the middle of this time that the Scaffie was popular, so the 1500s, I think, we get this monarch in the UK, King James I, and I guess he was one of the first people that I've read of historically proposing that we have a fishing industry. He could see that the Netherlands had the beginning of quite a thriving herring industry, with some stunning ships to go with it, and could see that Scotland had this resource as well. He didn't seem to follow up on it in that moment in a way that really impacts boats. It's also worth saying that at that point Scotland, for him, was just what we know of as mainland Scotland. And that Shetland and Orkney were able to build these beautiful wooden boats as well, still like the Scaffie, but usually with timber from Scandinavia. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, for your idea of Scotland now, very different to their idea. And Scotland was like very much a divided land. Shetland and Orkney still north. Parts of the Western Isles at that point were beginning to be ceded back to Scotland, but a lot of them still had a huge amount of Norse influence. And that these boats were being like shipped across the North Sea, like almost like flat pack IKEA furniture from Norway and Sweden, is really interesting, because I mean, if you've ever been to Orkney and Shetland, where are you going to get the wood to build a boat? So you had to, and it seems pretty industrious of them to do that, actually. I guess a necessity, but also maybe supportive as a nation, I think, for the Norwegian rule to be providing that, because when Scottish rule took over in Shetland, there wasn't any delivery of timber. No. Yeah, they took on a lot more basket work and weaving using the grasses and the rushes, but it did stop the construction of boats and the development of fishing in quite a big way for quite a long time. Yeah, definitely. And I don't want to get like too into nitty gritty, but I guess you could almost argue that by keeping the people of the Northern Isles in good stead with fishing boats and keeping them happy and healthy and wealthy, it's sort of enacting a little bit of soft power over Scotland, because it's this idea of like encroaching, look, these people are on your doorstep, but there are people, and they're a lot better off with us than they are with you, because we can give them these things you can't give them, and even if you wanted to give them, why would you? Yeah. So it's this, I mean, I could talk for hours about sea power and the existential idea of that. I'm not going to go into it, it's so tangential, but I think it also feeds in a little bit to what the Dutch were doing at the time. The Dutch, by having this fishing industry that was developing, not only was it a great tool for them economically, but it was also a way of them showing off their technology and might to other nations. It's like, look, we have the beginnings of like a really powerful industry. You can't match it. Try.
Genuinely,
I dare you to try. So that sort of set the scene, I guess, for like, I mean, it's going back a long time, but eventually what became a lot of European fishing industry was like quite competitive. So, yeah. Anyway, that's a long way from the Scaffie.
So the Scaffie is still going anyway. So the Scaffie was going 1700s, still going in the 1800s, but
yeah.
as sadly the British Empire grew in its might, it grew in its connection of resources, of timber, of African trees that you could use the bark of to treat nets and sails to preserve them really well, of fibre to make rigging.
Yep.
And alongside this, boats were gradually getting bigger. The need for a connected fishing industry was becoming bigger, especially because fish could be preserved.
Yep.
And we do see across the late 1700s and early 1800s the development of another boat as well.
Yeah, so this, I mean, there was a few different boats being developed at this time, but I think the one we're going to focus on is the Fifie. So
yeah,
so
that's what I was sort of thinking of in my
head.
head.
I was sort of like, okay, that's fine.
Yeah,
Yes.
those were the development of many boats.
Yeah. So the Fifie is a boat that, like, it's sort of our idea of a modern Fifie fulfills that symbol of a sort of Scottish fishing boat. We're getting much closer now to like the Zulus that we spoke about in the last episode. And Fifies were generally bigger boats. They were built to be stronger, they were heavier, they had a larger draft, so they needed deeper harbours, and they could stay at sea longer chasing the fish.
Yeah.
But they sort of began to be developed at the same time that harbour infrastructure was improving as well, which is what we spoke about in the last episode, but it's really relevant here as well. Obviously the name Fifie comes from Fife, the Kingdom of Fife, which I'm sure most of you have heard of, which is on the east coast of Scotland, sort of between Dundee and Edinburgh, between the two firsts there. And there's a lot of large towns that grew up around the fishing industry all along that coast, and these boats were built in the really prestigious boatyards that were developing there as well. So these boats were bigger, which meant they were more powerful. They had a larger sail area, which meant they were quicker as well, and that propelled the idea of this greater sense of industry. You could get a much bigger haul. There was more demand, so you could get more money. Ergo, the boat grows, and it's sort of self-fulfilling. This
completely. You could land the fish on a quay or in a harbour. You could unload the deck more easily.
Yeah.
You could leave the boat there and get out the next day really quickly and easily.
Yeah, and these designs sort of continued to grow in size, but they were still open deck boats. It's important to remember that. They sometimes had like a bulkhead forward, which would just provide a little bit of shelter. Yeah. But really only for like, it was like kind of like a crawl space. It was really small. Yeah. Because it was all about maximising catch. So there was fish. There would have been fish everywhere, if it was a good haul. But they're not particularly pleasant places to be in any kind of like medium to large sea state. So.
Yeah, and it's worth saying that the Fifie began to be made with a carvel construction, and it's not necessarily the most important distinction to make right now, and we're not going to go really far into the origin of that, but it's the construction that would have been used by the Romans or the Phoenicians down in the Mediterranean, where the planks of the hull are alongside each other compared to overlapping like the Vikings. And this makes it stronger if it's going to stand on its keel and dry out in a harbour or be leaning against a wall. And it probably travelled up from the south up through the UK and became quite ubiquitous at this point through the 1800s on the east coast of Scotland.
It was also, my understanding is that it was easier to mass produce carvel boats as well.
Seems like it.
Seems like it was anyway. I mean, obviously the technology was always improving, so the techniques to steam wood to bend planks was always improving as well.
Yeah.
So all of those things combine to make these boats, to sort of combine to make boatyards that were able to build these much larger boats. And it meant that you got Fifies, open deck Fifies that were potentially 60, 70 foot long, which is pretty sizable.
Yeah.
And must have been quite a sight. Unfortunately, we don't have any of those left. There are Fifies, which we're going to talk about later, that still survive, but no open boats. And there's probably quite a good reason for that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there was a big event in the middle of the 19th century that sort of put a halt to that design trend and sort of radically altered the industry.
Yeah, so is this going to be the Eyemouth fishing disaster?
The Eyemouth fishing disaster is a little bit later.
Okay.
But it is also it's a different fishing disaster.
Yeah.
So this specifically was a fishing disaster that happened in 1848.
Yeah.
And it's quite infamous.
Yes.
Mainly because of the sheer loss of life, which is pretty alarming. But a big storm blew up off the east coast. It caught a lot of the fishing fleets unawares. They weren't able to run for shelter or harbour, and I think a couple of hundred boats were lost off the coast of Wick, and these were boats primarily from Fraserburgh to Wick, so there would be Banff boats, Inverness boats, and then boats from Wick and Fraserburgh themselves. And it was worldwide news. Like there's newspaper reports about this accident all across Europe because of the sheer loss of life. I mean, if we're talking hundreds of boats, we're probably talking 400 or 500 men in one storm.
Yeah.
It's pretty horrifying. So because of the status of this accident, this disaster, the government commissioned a report, an inquiry into why this happened, why is the industry so sort of at risk of something like this. And it's a really useful report for historians because the designs, the drawings that were used in the report are some of the best of boats like Scaffies that remain. So there are really excellent drawings of these designs of the boats that were lost, and it's pretty apparent that the main reason that they were lost was almost all of them were open boats that got swamped in high seas. So the main finding of the inquiry was to try and find a compromise with the fishermen to have a covered deck boat that would be safer for their own well-being.
Yeah, and I think that might not have been so well received from what I've read.
No, it is generally, I think there was an understanding that it probably is good to have a covered boat, but there's a lot of compromises with that. It reduced the amount of working space you had. It was against the tradition of what had always been.
Yeah, so, and it was being proposed, I guess, by someone from very far away.
So yeah, someone very far away.
London.
Yeah. Well, it was commissioned by a navy man. The man who was in charge of writing the report was a man called Captain Washington.
Right.
So the idea of there being a authority far away telling you what you can and can't do wasn't well received. No. Particularly someone who was in the Royal Navy. Yeah. And now the Royal and Merchant Navies have a long history of not particularly getting on, and fishermen were always generally quite wary of navy men. They saw them as quite ostentatious, quite camp in our modern sense of the word. There's the whole Jack Tar stereotype of this period as well, the idea that sailors have it really good compared to soldiers or farmers, that they get to travel the world and show the flag and be happy with rum and jolly with their mates. So fishermen wouldn't have been massively happy at this at this man coming in and telling them what they can and can't do. But eventually the government got their way, and new boats after this period, especially bigger boats, were built with closed decks.
Right. And another suspicion that I've read around that was that fishermen thought they might be swept off the surface of the deck.
Yeah.
Because, of course, the edges have to be very low to pull the nets onto the deck or onto the surface. Yeah. Okay, so there's a big shift there in how boats would have looked and felt to sail.
Yeah. So, but in some ways, although the fishermen were against it, it actually really improved things for them. So having an enclosed boat meant a couple of things. If you were in a storm, you're a lot safer generally. It's also a nicer place to be. But it meant that the boats, it probably actually gave the boats more room to grow as well.
Yeah.
Because you've got sort of, I mean, I'm not a naval architect, I don't really understand this, but you seem to have more space because you can build a bigger boat which is more sort of structurally integral with a closed deck, rather than something which is sort of relying on the structure purely of the keel.
Yeah.
You can build bulkheads throughout a closed boat which is a bit more structurally sound.
100%. And the additional timber needed to make a deck for a boat can be very affordable compared to finding more bends for frames, for example, which are typically oak, often a natural bend.
Mm-hmm.
So a resource that certainly in the UK we have very little of now, but the straight pieces of pine that you might use for a deck, and if you're lucky something a bit more fancy, are still accessible.
Yeah.
Would have been pretty affordable and would have added a huge amount of integrity to the design.
Definitely.
So useful to move forward with, and they did move forward with it.
They did, yeah. And the boats just kept getting bigger. So you get to a point in the sort of around about the Eyemouth disaster in 1881, a lot of the boats there were now closed deck boats. It was the frosty of the storm. It was sort of a once in a blue moon storm that swept up off the east coast, caught the boats unawares, combined with slightly abnormal tides, which meant they couldn't run back to the ports that they would have used for shelter, which meant that a lot of boats got stranded. And in a lot of cases of disasters like this, the boats, especially now that they're closed decks, they're not actually swamped at sea. As they're running for shore, they get swept up against, bars,
rocks,
cliffs,
skerries.
Whatever. It's they usually meet their end on the shore or close to the shore.
Yeah.
Because they're very sort of well built boats with great structural integrity, so they can weather the storms at sea. It was actually almost like a poison chalice running for the shore. It was in some ways more dangerous.
But in the northeast of Scotland, we do reach a boat that almost specialised in running for shore and moving into these harbours or between skerries into an enclosed space. Shall we move on to introduce the Zulu?
Yeah, I'd love to. I think the Zulu is, we spoke a fair bit about it in the last episode. The Zulu being like the last stepping stone of our story. Of sailing,
our fishing sail technology.
It's combines two of the boats that we've spoken about. So one is the Fifie and the other one is the Scaffie. So it took these two much older designs and sort of merged them together. And there's quite a funny story about why that is. So I'll let you tell it because I think you like it more than I do.
I'm not sure. I'm a bit sceptical. The story, I think, is in Lossiemouth. Someone was commissioning a boat and it was called None Such because it would be different from anything that came previously. And supposedly it's the marriage of two families, one who traditionally fished the Scaffie, and the Scaffie has this quite stunning and striking raked stern, and one who traditionally fished the Fifie, which has a far more blunt and angular outline of the hull. And so they had this blunt stem that went straight down into the water, usually plumb, and then this raking stern combined. And for the next 20 years they moved between clinker and carvel construction using the stereotypical hull type of each boat, using both of these. but this boat, Nonsuch, was very quickly pretty popular. She used the same lug rig that was mainly being used as well by the Fifie and the Scaffie, so very quickly would have been able to be used by any local crew or fishermen around.
Yeah, and I think the Zulu captures certainly my imagination more than the other boats because of sort of the majesty of it. It's sort of the pinnacle of this technology. You've got two sort of not competing but quite different design philosophies that have met to create something that's sort of the best of both worlds, and they were, by all accounts, magnificent. They were very fast, very manoeuvrable, and I mean, having seen them up close, they're very beautiful boats as well, just to look at. I mean, I know that's not important if you're a fisherman, but it certainly helps. And also that, you know, these boats were being, the first Zulu, which I think is something I mentioned in the last podcast, was commissioned well after the technology was already there to build steam fishing boats.
Yeah.
So they still thought clearly that this was the way forward, at least for a little bit longer, that it was worth investing in this new design because at the time it was quicker. There's stories there's a really great passage in Vanishing by Carr and Mason, which talks about, this is a lot later, this is in the 1930s, of Zulu still operating out of Stornoway.
Yeah.
One of which was probably Murneg, which is we'll go into, which is in the future, which is a really beautiful and interesting boat. But it talks about how these 6 Zulus came charging out of Stornoway, and they would leave the steam drifters for dust.
Yeah.
They would just fly past them with a good wind, and I don't know, there's something very romantic about that.
There truly is, and I guess part of how well they could sail is that being well-known technology and being a well-used rig, people could be very skilled at sailing. Yeah. And certainly reports of Murneg, which translates from Gaelic as the Darling One, which was one of the largest Zulus, reports of her sailing is that they would sail in the heaviest wind when every other boat had its sails down or all its reefs tied, and they still had the full sail out because they were so confident in their skill and their heritage. Yeah. And this is something you can't get with a new technology like a steam drifter.
No, absolutely not. It's pretty magical, really. And there's a few other quite quirky things about the Zulu. So the name, recently you might be wondering why?
Yeah, so what do you think of the name? It is spelled the same Zulu as a Zulu warrior. Yeah,
I again, I'm a little bit skeptical, but the generally considered reason is that it matches up historically with the time of the Zulu Wars in Southern Africa, and there's a little bit of discourse about whether the Scots were more sympathetic to the Zulu cause against the British, and ergo they decided to name this class after those peoples, or after what was going on.
Yeah, this class of boat.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course the Zulu warriors have this incredible, fierce, strong and distinct culture around them that the Scots might have easily romanticised or hoped to feel an affinity with.
Yeah, that's the bit I think I struggle with the most, given how entrenched Scotland was as part of the British Empire at the time, and how a lot of Scottish people benefited and exploited people around the empire. I maybe struggle with that, but I think it's a wonderful notion, and it's great to imagine that. But yeah, I don't think that's something we haven't spoken about yet as well, which is also quite a quirky naming convention, is the Baldie. So firstly, like, what is a Baldie?
So it's a larger... Well, we've read a few definitions and we're kind of still discussing this.
Yeah.
But it tends to be as something like a smaller clinker Fifie.
Yes.
Something that still has a raking stem to some extent, but not to the same extent as the Zulu. Mm-hmm. That is often clinker, that often has most of a deck, and from what I've seen, almost always one mast.
Yes, yeah. I think I've maybe read reports in one of the texts that I've looked at about a two-masted Baldie, but it seems like almost all of them were single-masted. And the name Baldie, you might think it's because of like a balding man or whatever, or maybe it's to do with something like that. But no, it's apparently the time when Baldies were really prevalent was a similar time to Giuseppe Garibaldi's coup and attempted rise to power in Italy. It's quite niche history, actually. It's very interesting that the Scots picked up on this.
On the Italian Revolution.
On the Italian Revolution. They were clearly very politically aware.
Yeah, it seems like
and
it.
had a good understanding of current events. But yeah, Baldie shortened Garibaldi. But also, I quite like the idea of it being named after the biscuit. So the biscuit Garibaldi, which came after, which was named after the general as well.
Ah.
Maybe they were like, oh, it's a cute little biscuit. It's a cute little boat. It's Baldie.
Yeah.
I don't know.
If it is the Garibaldi leader, then it is again identifying another fierce figure.
Yeah.
With the latest seaworthy boat.
It is.
So there could be some connection
There
between
could
that
be.
story, and they could support each other.
Yeah, we'll go with that.
For now.
And
a working conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, that's the sort of anecdotal history that's almost impossible to prove. And in some ways, it's great that we can't disprove it because it allows you to speculate amusingly, which is great.
Yeah. So all of this happened alongside a fast-growing herring industry, which was motivating, pushing, funding, and supporting the rise in scale of boats and in the amount of boats that were being thrown in the sea. And they were building them very fast, using timber from the UK, but also from other places too.
Yeah. So the UK had a bit of a shortage of timber generally, mainly because the Royal Navy has a addiction to building warships, which meant that a lot of good timber was basically eradicated from the UK. It's the reason you don't see that many oak trees in the UK anymore.
For sure.
So a lot of wood had to be exported from, thankfully, having a wonderfully large empire is very useful for that. So exporting wood from Canada, but also from allies in the Baltic. A lot of wood came from Scandinavia and from Finland and Russia. All of it sort of fed into this globalized industry where you would land a herring, say, on a Friday in Fraserburgh. That fish would be packed. It would be gutted, packed, iced, and then by train it would be taken south to London. It might be then put on a steamer, and it might end its life in India. It's incredible, even though this is 140 years ago, how globalized the world was even then.
Yeah.
And we think now about ways in which our food ends up on our plate. Even then, it was sometimes still travelling half around the world.
And it was becoming huge. Yeah, and it really is due to this expansion of empire that building larger and larger fishing vessels in what now are remote corners of Scotland was possible.
Absolutely. And it's the reason that we can thank, it's one of the main reasons we can be thankful for having like large towns in Scotland and on the east coast and in the north. Those towns wouldn't exist if this industry not facilitated that.
But also had they not been cleared from the land through the clearances.
Exactly, yeah.
Which is something we've not touched on, but which is what pushed a lot of people into fishing.
Definitely, yeah. And a need for work when there was no work in the land, you turn to the sea.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, like a port like Wick, I think, is a really great example of that. But also Helmsdale, Goldsby, Bora, down that coast. You know, these were areas where there was enormous amounts of clearing. People were pushed to the sea, and they became some of the most profitable fishing towns in the whole of the UK. They were perfectly positioned to give them access to the North Sea. Yeah,
while also not having ownership or stake in very much anymore because they'd lost their land and no one owns the sea.
No, yeah.
So then it did allow greater landowners to perpetuate.
Absolutely.
Shall we just introduce engines?
Yeah.
A little bit.
I think this is sort of coming towards the end of our story. But when I already mentioned that when the first Zulu was being built, the technology was there to build fishing boats with engines.
Yeah.
Now these started as steam engines. They were really simple. You'd have a great big boiler, and you'd have some kind of expansion engine, and they could be very simple, but because the technology was relatively basic for its time, they would be huge. They take up a huge amount of space. So early steam drifters needed to be a lot bigger than your Zulu in order to even you could almost double the length of a Zulu and you'd get a steam drifter that would be able to catch the same amount of herring because of the amount of space taken up by the machinery. And they were slow.
Yeah.
They were really slow. And they were pretty tub-like. Like, even though the hull shape is very much derived from what went before, it's not the hydrodynamics of having a propeller drive you compared to having sail drive you driving you completely changes the way that your boat moves through the water.
Yeah.
And so steam was great, but coal was expensive as well. That's something else to consider. So you have all this new technology brings with it
huge teething problems.
Yeah. You need more infrastructure to make this technology work efficiently, and that took a while to bed in.
So some problems might have just been simply overheating and being in a wooden boat, might have been the vibrations of the engines shaking the planks apart. So ultimately it did mean that the wooden hulls, which had been perfect for sailing, were left behind.
Yep.
And now we find engined boats made of metal and synthetics are far more common.
Yes.
Well, they are the most common.
Yeah.
And could expand hugely in size, take on huge crews.
And as technology improves, the engines get smaller, the more space you have for your hull and your catch. And it takes you pretty much up to close to now, where you have these diesel turbine boats. They can be, the big factory trawlers are like, some of them are almost 200 feet long plus. Some of them, I think, like the deep sea ones, they're ships. They're factories that they're almost they're production lines of fish rather than this idea of small scale subsistence fishing that we started with. It's gone all the way up.
Very much.
Thank you for listening to Murmurs on the Mooring. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you'll join us again soon for episode 3. As ever, your feedback and stories are very welcome to us. We'd love to hear from you, either by Spotify, YouTube in the comments, by Facebook, Instagram under the name Murmurs on the Mooring, or by our email address, which is tradboatpodcast@gmail.com. Many thanks for listening.